Hello, everyone. My name is Madison Dronsky, and I will be your moderator. I work in our knowledge management practice here at Enterprise Knowledge, and I'm excited to be hosting today's session. Before I hand the mic over to Zach and Mary, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about this presentation and the GoToWebinar platform. Please note that all participant lines have been muted, but we would still love to hear from you. If you have a question for one of our speakers, please feel free to send it through the chat tab on the GoToWebinar control panel, or by tweeting us at EK Consulting. We'll answer questions at the end of the session, and if we don't get to your question during today's webinar, we will be sure to follow up afterwards. Also, today's webinar will be available on demand within 24 hours after the live session via our website. We will send an email with the link following the conclusion of this webinar. Please feel free to share this link with anyone you think would be interested. So without any further ado, I am pleased to introduce today's speakers, Zach Wahl and Mary Little.
Afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining. It's Zach here, and right off the bat, I will apologize in advance. There is a kid playing basketball next door, and I have a crying baby in the other room. So the joys of remote work, let's see how we do here. We really wanted to do this because, like many of you, we are suddenly in a place that we are experimenting with something that we weren't really totally prepared for, weren't really planning to have happen. We have now our entire team working remotely for the first time ever. And though we've always had a pretty liberal remote work from home type of policy, what we found is that very few people actually took us up on it. We have a really social culture, we're highly collaborative, people wanted to come to the office. So this has been completely new for us, and it got Mary and I thinking about how this is actually a great example of how knowledge management can actually fuel healthy, good, productive remote work. And that's really what we want to talk with you about today. Where the presentation will go is really a few different places. One is just a very quick background on how we talk about knowledge management. The reason that we want to begin with that is just because it is one of those terms that gets thrown around so frequently. For some organizations, it's a comprehensive enterprise strategy. For others, it just means that they plugged in SharePoint and said, good luck. And so we want to talk about what it means to us. And from there, it's going to frame up pretty clearly how we think good KM supports remote work. We'll break down some ways that that happens, some ways that life has changed, and then really conclude the hour with very specific recommendations on how all of you can either continue your work in this area to make remote work more effective, because it looks like we're going to be here a little while, or to really do some quick wins, some short examples, even if you don't have comprehensive KM strategies in place. So we'll dive right into it. First off, this is me, the founder and CEO of Enterprise Knowledge. I've been doing this work for my entire career, over 20 years at this point. It's something I am obviously really passionate about. I hope that comes through over the course of the hour. But what's fun about my position is that I get to approach this from a couple different perspectives. I get to talk to you as the KM practitioner, the person who is leading knowledge management engagements, but also as the CEO, the person who's trying to make his company work more effectively, to encourage his team to be more productive, and really talk about how KM influences that.
And I'm Mary Little, and I lead our knowledge management strategy and design practice here at EK. And I really help our clients find and discover the information and people that they need to do their jobs. And what I've learned is that shifting to fully remote has made that even more difficult. So we really look forward to sharing some insights on what's worked for us, as well as some of our clients, and hopefully that helps you.
Perfect. So very briefly, here's how we define KM. KM involves people, culture, processes, and enabling technologies necessary to capture, manage, share, and find information. I promise that's going to be the only time we read off of a slide here. But the reason that it's so important to unpack this a little bit is that I think it actually expresses exactly why remote work can be a challenge and why good KM actually helps with remote work. When we're talking about an individual who relies on people, who is shaped by the culture of the organization, who needs to be able to have easy processes about how to find the right information, how to share it, and then all of that being pulled together into a situation where a lot of those tools are taken away, where the physical nature of all of those efforts suddenly evaporates. We're left with a really challenging situation, and that's where we're at today. Another way of expressing this is in the way that we love to define knowledge management. Good KM at its core enables actions. It enables people to more effectively take their tacit knowledge, the stuff that's in their head, and share it, make it into explicit knowledge that can be digested by others. It allows information to be captured in different ways. So rather than rather than information just getting hidden in email, rather than information just getting dropped in a shared drive to go die, good KM enables information to be captured such that it is more effectively managed and such that it can actually be found and leveraged and acted upon by the right people within the organization. At the end of the day, all good KM is about enabling connections for a consumer of knowledge to connect to the right information that they need to do their job, to connect to a mentor or an expert to help them know how to do their job, to connect to a body of knowledge, to connect to a community of practice from whom they can learn and really develop their own skills. All of this again, is harder to do when you don't get to walk down that hall and ask somebody a question, when you don't get to stumble upon a brown bag session and interact with colleagues you maybe didn't know that well. So though the purpose of this is really talking about remote work, I think you're going to be able to extrapolate. A lot of what we're saying here is just as true for global organizations that don't have the benefit of having everybody physically co-located. So what you're going to hear us doing a fair bit of is talking about the challenges of remote work and the benefits of KM in terms of what we consider to be these 5 elements of knowledge management: people, process, content, culture, and technology. When we're talking about people, we're talking about how knowledge naturally flows through the organization, who holds the knowledge, who needs the knowledge. How does somebody on their very first day employed know who to reach out to for answers? I often talk about those human search engines within an organization, those people that seem to know where all the right content is and where all the good answers are. Well, how does somebody who is working totally remotely even become aware of who that person is? From a process perspective, we're talking about really how knowledge matures, how an idea turns into a piece of content, how a piece of content is enhanced with metadata, how it is maintained over time to get better instead of worse, how content effectively stays right within the organization. From that content perspective, we're really talking about all the different types of stuff you have. This is your learning content. This is how an employee gets upskilled more quickly. These are your policies and procedures, how we ensure that your employees are doing the right things and acting on the right information. But this is also all of the product of your work, all of the knowledge that your organization creates. It is really infrequent that one of your employees is going to start from scratch on a deliverable or on a presentation. They're generally going to begin by reusing something that already exists. And so making that more readily available to them, giving them better, righter starting points is going to make them more productive, more effective. It's going to upskill them more quickly. Another big piece that's missing from remote work, unless we're careful, is the concept of culture. Especially growing organizations thrive on culture. Maybe they don't have all the process in place, maybe they don't have the pristine content, but they're driven by a culture of excellence or a culture of knowledge sharing. So how do you replicate that? How do you encourage that when you're potentially remote, when you don't get to see the leadership modeling that right behavior? And then the last piece, and it's increasingly something that is spoken about alongside KM, is technology. Now, we list technology last because we want to stress the fact that it's an enabling factor. It is a piece that helps KM happen, but it is not in and of itself knowledge management. So I go back to the SharePoint example. Just because you've installed SharePoint, just because you have a bunch of users on it, does not mean that you're doing KM. At least it doesn't mean that you're doing it well or right. And also recognize the fact that there's really no such thing as a KM technology. We'll show this on a slide a little bit later, but good KM suites are a conglomeration of a whole bunch of technologies wired together in ways that are intuitive to the users. So the big key here is that it's not worth doing the technology piece unless you're doing the people, process, content, culture pieces first. And secondly, the message here is that we really want to make sure that technology is seen as the enabling factor. Now, in today's remote work situations, that technology piece is super critical. So I don't want to suggest that it's not key to this. And we'll be giving you some examples of how technology can be used for video chat and meetings, how it can be used for collaboration, how it can be used to collaborate on document creation, how it can be used to just coordinate activities. So stay tuned for all of that as we move forward.
Great. So to a certain degree, we're all knowledge workers, right? So not only do we consume information, but we're also responsible for sharing it and creating it. So life about a month ago, this is what it looked like for a lot of us. We woke up, if you're anything like me, went straight for that caffeine and headed to work. And of course, no 2 days are the same, but during our typical workday, we do several things pretty in common each day, right? So we start off by checking our emails, making sure that we're caught up on everything, and we've responded to people who need something from us right away. And typically that leads to us producing some sort of task list. We have a list of things that we want to prioritize today, and in order to complete those things, we need knowledge and information to do that. So whether that is a policy or procedure or just information about a certain topic, we go throughout our day really trying to figure out how do we get that information. And in certain cases, we might log on to our intranets or the various repositories of information within our organization. But in other cases, you get up and you walk over to a neighbor's desk and you ask them a question. What I've learned from supporting a variety of different clients is that they typically know very well the people who are close to them, who sit physically near them, because they interact with those people on a regular basis. And so they know what those people know and how those people can help them out. And then in cases where they want to look for information, there are a variety of different places and people have different preferences of where to find that information. And then eventually it's time for lunch, one of my favorite times of day. And I think that what I've learned there is, in addition to when you're just congregating around the water cooler, you learn a lot about people. So you learn about things that may or may not be work related. But in those interactions, you're really discovering other things about them that you didn't know, like hidden talents and areas of expertise, or potentially networks that they have that you didn't know that they had, and now they know that they can introduce you to somebody who can help you with your efforts. So there is this kind of back and forth of looking for that information in repositories and in the people that you know, but also discovering information that you didn't expect to find in the systems and in the work environment. So typically a day would look like that, and then you commute back home, and then you start all over again the next day. So what's changed? Let's look at what life looks like now for many of us. Many of us don't have that commute anymore, so it's given us a lot of time back in our day, and we change from our night pajamas to our day pajamas and get to work. And what we realize is that those systems are still there for us, the ones that we could access via our computers. But what's no longer there is our ability to get up and walk over to somebody and ask them a question. And there are less opportunities, especially given the circumstances that we're in right now, to have casual conversations that lead to the discovery of things that you didn't know that could help you. And so we're in this very interesting predicament where we have to figure out how do we leverage KM to continue to connect us to information that we need to be able to go about our day.
Yeah, I love the how this slide shines a light on the current challenge, right? Because what's left, not crossed off, are largely the technology components of our job. Sure, you can still pick up the phone, but do you really even know everybody's phone numbers? Do you know how to get to the right people? And so what I believe the current situation is doing is shining a light upon the current state of an organization's technologies and systems, not just whether they have the right tools, but how well organized and designed are they? How clean is the organization's content? Do users actually have the ability to get to not just the stuff they need to do their job, but then to trust that it is right? And that becomes one of the biggest challenges.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about how we can address some of those challenges. So Zach and I will talk about this in terms of these 3 C's here. So connections, collaboration, and culture. So we'll define them a bit here, and then we'll dive deeper into what that looks like and what you can do to really focus in these various areas. So starting with KM connections, the very first thing that we talk about is how do we get our jobs done today? How do we complete our tasks in an effective and efficient way? Where do we start and where do we find the answers that we need? And beyond that, how do we connect ourselves to the people who can not only tell us what we need to do, but also work with us to get things done that we wouldn't be able to accomplish by ourselves? So that's your first C. And your second C here is collaboration. So many of us are interested in not just doing our jobs well, but continuing to improve the way that we do it over time. And so it's incredibly important that we have access to learning and development materials, but also the experiences that we typically get when we're in an office of learning and growing and being mentored and coached. And that's incredibly important because we really can't achieve very much just on our own. As an organization, we really have to work with other people to get the things done that we want to achieve. And then lastly, and something that we believe is very, very important. So it's not enough, again, to just do your job well and continue to improve. You want to be surrounded by a culture that really helps to motivate you to do the right things and make it clear what those right things are. And so we want to flourish in that environment by seeing our leaders communicate to us what it means to practice good KM. But beyond them just saying this is what good KM looks like, we want to physically see them demonstrate those behaviors. So for example, just seeing Zach set up a check-in with his leadership team to see how everybody's doing gives me the tip to say, hey, I should be doing that with my team on a regular basis. And so even though we've been virtual, I've been able to see how he has reacted to the changes in circumstances. And then lastly, from an individual perspective, are we being incentivized and motivated in the right ways to really practice good KM? Do we even know what that looks like and how we can measure it? So we'll really want to talk about things in the terms of these 3 C's.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, this to me aligns very much to tactical and long term, right? So from the connection side, we're really talking about how can we be effective today? How can we empower our users to get their job done immediately? This is stuff about finding the right information, acting on the right information, finding the right resources, being able to do your job. And so there is a continuation of operations. There is absolutely no break in quality or productivity. KM collaboration is really about how we help people get better at doing their job over the longer run. So rather than saying, are we doing okay today? We're instead saying, are we getting better every day? Are we improving? And so here it's about helping people learn, upskilling them, giving them the right resources to effectively develop and grow in their careers. And then the KM culture piece is the long term. By creating a culture within the organization, we're incentivizing the right behavior. We're getting everybody swimming in the same direction. And so if there's one big outcome from KM Connections, it's productivity. If there's one big outcome from KM Collaborations, it's quality. It's better quality over time. And if there's one big outcome from culture, it is long-term value, that retention of employees and satisfaction that comes from everybody doing the right thing, doing it in a same way, and knowing that they will be recognized and rewarded for it from the organization. So let's get into connections first, the day-to-day stuff, the activities. And again, we're using our 5 categories of people, process, content, culture, and technology. Now, I'm not going to hit on all of these, but what you're going to see is the theme here is that this is really about the elements that require somebody or enable somebody to find the stuff they need to do their job. One of the core concepts of knowledge management is exactly that. How do I find the stuff I need to do my job and do it right? And so from a people perspective, this is really just about helping the individual be aware of who can help them with a particular thing. The most common example of this is an expert finder type of tool. And I know we say, oh, but that's a technology. In reality, it is, but it only works when you've tagged people with the right metadata, with the right skills, with the right areas of expertise, when you've applied the governance to that in order that people aren't self-selecting themselves as experts on topics that they're not really part of. From a content perspective, this is where we're really talking about that core stuff. Somebody needs to do one of 3 things. One is do their job right, meaning what are the processes, what are the procedures, what are the training materials, what are the job aids that allow me to not screw up, to do it the way the company wants me to do it. Number 2 is the stuff that an employee needs in order to be more productive, meaning that they're finding the information that they need to complete their missions. One of my favorite statistics is that 30 to 40% of a knowledge worker's time is wasted waiting for answers, looking for information, or recreating information that existed within the enterprise but of which they were unaware. So by ensuring that we're giving them the right content that is actionable and clean, we're helping to reduce that 30 to 40% of wasted time. And in the most mature organizations, we're almost negating that statistic completely. And then the third thing we really want to do with content is ensure that people stay tethered to the organization, that they understand their benefits, that they understand their colleagues, that they're connecting to the organization. Traditionally, and it always cracks me up, historically, one of the most searched upon searches on any intranet was the cafeteria menu for the day. So obviously, people aren't checking out the cafeteria menu anymore because they're not going to the cafeteria. So what is driving them to your intranet? What is driving them to stay connected, to stay tethered? And that's a question that we will come back to. And then, the other big piece of this is culture. I am a big fan, and frankly, I'll admit it, as CEO, I was not an early adopter to work from home. I really resisted it, especially in our field, because to me, so much of learning and interaction and innovation happens like this, happens with me looking at somebody, getting to whiteboard with them and sit down with them. And so for me, a lot of the face-to-face tools, the Zooms, the Skypes, the GoToMeetings have been absolutely critical in this stage. And it's the sort of thing where I actually find myself video chatting more than I'm remote. I used to pick up the phone, stick the ear pods in and have conversations. And now where I was doing that, I'm very naturally video chatting people because I want to see their face. I want to ensure they're engaged. I want to take that opportunity to look at them and say hi. And then again, beyond that, from the technology standpoint, we're really talking about findability technologies here. Search is absolutely critical. So some of you might be in a situation right now where you are in crisis mode because you don't have the right content readily available and findable for your people to be able to do their job remotely. And we'll talk about some of the mechanisms that we can use to address that now. Mm-hmm. Now, from a collaboration piece, again, we're kind of going longer term now, month to month. Like I said, we're going to be in this for a while. So now it's not about how do I do my job today. Instead, it's about how do I get better at my job? How do I learn? And so here we talk about building connections with people for mentor-mentee, where, as I previously talked about experts being that how to get my question answered. Now I'm talking about, well, who are the people from whom I can learn? So sure, it's still that expert finder, but it's a different use for it. It's not being used as a directory. It's being used as a means to create longer term connections that can enable upskilling. Same thing with content. Yeah, we still want people to find content. We still want them to find all of that content that helps them do their job. But now we also want to supplement that by helping them find the content that will help them learn, that will help them develop. So here we're talking about mapping competencies and skills, potentially building adaptive learning tools and building job aids into processes so that the right people are actually learning on the job, which, by the way, regardless of whether you're remote or not, is by far the most efficient and effective way of learning. If somebody takes a class, they only retain 10 to 25% of that which they learn from the instructor. If instead they learn at the point of need, if they learn on the job, if they are learning with little micro-learning bits over the course of a day, they're going to consume and retain over 80% of that knowledge. So yeah, you need it for remote work because you can't get everybody showing up for a class anymore, but it's got that added benefit of actually being more effective here. So that's part of that return on investment. Employing a lot of these techniques, yes, helps your remote workers, but they're actually more effective as well. Again, from the culture bit here, again, this was one of my major areas of hesitation in allowing remote work. I was worried that people wouldn't learn from each other as much as they previously had, that water cooler type of knowledge transfer, that the organic stuff wouldn't happen as much. And let's face it, it doesn't. You need to be more purposeful about it. And so part of what we're going to be talking about here is being more purposeful about it, scheduling time for those interactions. As Mary mentioned, we have instituted some new approaches to this. We'd always done knowledge shares. Every other Friday, we would do an hour where one member of the team would present on a technique or something they had learned. And we maintained those. They're now remote. But that 1 hour is not sufficient for what we want to do. And so both to drive culture and to ensure that people are really getting that cross-pollination, we've done a whole slew of different things. We have instituted virtual happy hours where everybody shows up and just kind of catches up and talks about what they're doing. We've created new Slack channels. We'll talk a little bit about those. And we've also created new fun ways to engage with each other. We've got a virtual Sudoku board going on Google Docs so that people can kind of pop in, check in with each other, play for a little bit, go back to their job. We are effectively building digital versions of that water cooler. And there's a big key there, and I really want to stress this point. For a long time, C-levels would resist the idea of online corporate tools being used for social purposes. I don't want my employees wasting time sharing pictures of their dogs and pictures of their kids and the recipes. And for a while, that was sort of the common wisdom. Yeah, that makes sense. These are corporate places. They should be used for work stuff only. But I think what we found is that some of the folks that are most effective at collaboration are people that are comfortable with each other, that care about each other. And so for each of you on the line now, ask yourself the question of what's the harm of people using some of your corporate tools to be a little social, to engage, to share more about themselves. Yeah, maybe it takes a little bit of time, but it's time that they were going to spend one way or the other anyway. And by harnessing that sort of connection, you're basically creating more comfort. You're creating more willingness for your employees to also help with work situations. You're creating more avenues by which somebody might naturally go to a place because they like the pictures of the dogs, but then they'll see that somebody's asking a question about how to use a particular product effectively, or if we have any starter materials on a particular topic, and they'll stay there and answer that. So I challenge people to shift the mindset a little bit and potentially encourage more of that social interaction. Let people be human on your corporate tools. Now, that also bleeds into this long-term concept of instilling culture remotely. Year to year, how do we build a culture of collaboration and knowledge sharing? So part of it's the stuff I just talked about. A lot of it is about getting leadership to use these same tools and act on them. If anyone read my blog last week about the same topic of remote work, you will see that there was a picture of me in a t-shirt and a baseball cap. And I've had half the team say, we've never seen you out of a suit. It was weird to see that, but it was also fun to see that. And so part of this is about leadership showing what it looks like to work from home and be comfortable doing that, be comfortable being a little bit of a different version of themselves, but still modeling the right behavior online. Part of it is about gamification. Now, I know gamification is one of those beat up terms. A lot of organizations have tried it and it hasn't really worked. But if harnessed properly, it's really just a matter of finding digital ways, finding remote ways to shine a light on good KM behavior, highlighting the people that are sharing their knowledge, that are taking the time to answer questions on Slack, that are joining the various knowledge shares and presenting. Again, having leadership actively participating in those formats is a great way of doing that, but going further with gamification and actually creating new leaderboards, creating contests and games of sharing knowledge. Mary mentioned she's saving a couple hours a day because she no longer has that long commute. So how do we harness that time? How do we encourage people to use that time to share knowledge, to write a blog, to coach a teammate, to really use that time for the organization's productivity when it comes into play? When we go even further than this, we get to start talking about harnessing AI to not just capture all of this knowledge, but push it to the right users, to actually create a positive feedback loop where the more knowledge that exists is the more knowledge that can be shared and pushed to users. That creates this positive feedback loop, as I said, that should, in large part, result in greater knowledge captured and greater knowledge shared. But it will also result in this. The idea that happy employees are good at knowledge management and good knowledge management makes happy employees. I actually think one of the reasons that EK has been so effective at shifting to a remote work situation is because we were already doing a lot of this stuff naturally. I'm proud to say we were eating our own dog food. We were practicing a lot of these good behaviors in the office physically together. And what that yielded is a group of people that cared about each other, that were rewarded for sharing knowledge, that were incentivized to create new knowledge, to capture it and manage it in a digital format such that others could act upon it and make it better over time. All of those things mean that we have had a pretty easy transition to remote work because that foundation existed. And so maybe the ship has sailed for this particular crisis. Maybe you didn't lay that foundation, but I also want to use this opportunity to paint the picture of how this can be done, what you can do with it once you get back into the office, how you can reprioritize KM as the critical tool to lay a long-term foundation for remote work and for the fuel of your employees.
Yeah. So we've talked about the what for a few minutes now. Let's roll up our sleeves and talk about the how. We're hoping that this part of the webinar really sparks some inspiration in all of you to really act on what you have control over and what you can do to really boost that collaboration, connection, and culture within your organization. So starting with connectedness here, content inventory and cleanup. This is incredibly fundamental because not only do you want to be able to find the information you need to be able to do your jobs, you want to be able to rely on it. You want to be able to act on it without having to confirm with a variety of different people on whether it's up to date or whether it's the latest version or if it's still applicable. You want that content to be good quality content that's relevant to what you're doing. And so think of content inventory and cleanup almost like cleaning up your closet or your junk drawer. A lot of times when we talk about this, people say, okay, this takes a lot of time, it's incredibly manual, and it takes a lot of labor. I don't have that kind of time. And so now that you have saved a lot of that time from your commute, if you're not focusing on something like content inventory, you know it's not an issue of time anymore. It's actually an issue of not understanding the value of it, or perhaps not knowing how to do it. So we want to provide you some really kind of step-based instructions here on how you could potentially do this. But again, there are a variety of different ways to do this. So one way is very, very simple. First and foremost, you have to select the subset of content that you want to focus on first. One mistake I see people making a lot here is trying to boil the ocean. They undergo a content inventory and cleanup effort for their entire organization, and the second that they start to do it, they realize, oh my gosh, there's so much content, and they lose the motivation to keep moving forward. So start with a smaller subset of content that is highly needed across the organization, and take that content and put it into some sort of spreadsheet or tracker where you can see all of your stuff in one place. And then you should determine, how do you determine whether that stuff is good quality? Is it the way that it's laid out? Is it the information that's in there? Is it the supplementary resources that are tied to it? Really go item by item, whether that's on the document or content item level or at the folder level, and decide what you're going to do with it. Are you going to update it? Are you going to archive it? Are you going to merge it with other content that's very similar? That way you're going through every single item and saying, what am I going to do with this? And that drives your plan for how you're going to actually clean up that content. So it's fairly simple, and to a certain degree can be pretty manual, but if you're doing much larger scale content inventory and cleanup, there are a variety of different automation tools and scripts that you can use to speed that up, but the general process is the same there. And then Zach mentioned an expert finder. So another recommendation that we often make is creating a people taxonomy. When we talk about taxonomy, we are usually talking about ways to describe content using a controlled vocabulary so that you can find it. But we have already talked about how it's not enough to find that information. We need to connect with the people who have the context to be able to take that information and actually help us apply it. And so from a taxonomy perspective, when you take somebody's profile and you tag it with certain things that are important and meaningful, like what skills do they have, what experience have they gained, what certifications have they acquired, what are they interested in, this helps you with some really concrete decision making and task execution. So whether you are staffing a new project and you want to figure out how many people do you have that are certified in Scrum and have worked in a particular industry, you can really leverage the people taxonomy that you've developed once it's implemented in some sort of system to find those people. And so this is applicable not just for remote work, but especially for organizations that are global. As I mentioned earlier, you know the people around you, you know what they know, and you can access that pretty quickly. But what about your office in Europe or in Asia? What projects are they working on that could potentially help you with what you're working on? That's where you can really take that people taxonomy and increase that connectedness. Great, so collaboration. Zach mentioned a few of the things that we do at EK that have really transferred itself fairly easily to our new work environment. And one of those things is virtual communities. Within our organization, we have experts in taxonomy and search and content strategy, but each day they are facing new challenges that they've never faced before. And so it's really helpful for them to be able to connect with other experts in the field who have seen different parts of how these various solutions have manifested themselves in their projects. So we want to talk about virtual communities in terms of technology, but also processes and ways to really engage people in what you've created for them. So here we have that pain point, and although we mention MS Teams here, you can see that there are a variety of tools out there that you can use to really develop these communities. But what we see is sometimes there isn't a clear or consistent strategy to developing these communities, and people are using different tools. There's different levels of maturity of their virtual communities. People don't know what their roles and responsibilities are as it relates to those communities, or when do we meet, what do we talk about. All of those things need to be part of a program that you have to develop these virtual communities. So making sure that you have a very clear direction as far as what tools you're going to use, what features and functionality of those tools are going to be leveraged for your communities, what's the process for everybody getting together, and how do you facilitate conversations in a meaningful way, who's responsible for what. That is incredibly important, both in person and remote. And then the second tip that we have here is to really develop your expert and expert program. So although we have here kind of a use case that's specific to a new hire coming on board and being connected with somebody who can help them learn the ropes and really step into that other person's shoes, this can really apply to any part of the life cycle of an employee. If you have people in your organization that are in retirement age, an expert and expert program could really help with that as well. The gist there is that you're not waiting until people are leaving the organization and walking out of the door with that knowledge before you implement some sort of knowledge transfer mechanism. You're really getting ahead of the game and being proactive. So one way that we've seen that done is through a dedicated day or couple of half days where you really focus on that knowledge transfer, but then making it a part of their day-to-day. It's really important for somebody who is an expert to not just have access to documentation about how to do something, but to work alongside an expert in that field and see how are they making decisions, what things are they looking for that you can't really document, but it's almost kind of instinctual. So that expert and expert program is incredibly important to make sure that the people in your organization are really learning the skills that they need to be able to do their job now and in the future.
Yeah, and I'll just paint the picture with a story here. We helped the National Park Service design what they call their Common Learning Portal. It's a combination of structured learning, unstructured learning, access to experts, a lot of the stuff that we've talked about here. But one of the coolest anecdotes once it rolled out was a quote from an expert in a really minute field who said, "I thought I was alone. I thought I was the only expert in 18th century masonry." And on the contrary, there was another one. There was somebody else out there that was an expert on this in a different park on the other side of the country. They were able to find each other through these virtual communities. They were then able to identify experts, people, because both of them were near the end of their career, other people self-selected as interested in these topics and began learning from these two experts. And so this is a great example of how designing the right platforms in a way that brings things together, not just content together, but people together, really enables remote work, remote learning, remote collaboration.
Yeah, I love that, Zach, because we talk about these in terms of these efforts as being individual efforts, but even with the expert and expert program, if you have a people taxonomy really powering that, you can make connections between people. So these individual efforts alone add a lot of value, but when you connect them with each other, it's a really robust KM program.
Excellent. So I mentioned technology before, and technology is this enabling factor. As I said earlier, there's no such thing really as a KM technology. I mean, sure, there's a couple tools on the market that purport to be that. But what we really see is that there's a potential KM knowledge and information management suite or ecosystem of different tools, and that collaboration layer that pulls together instant messaging, document sharing, collaboration, the ability to create team workspaces, all of these things sort of fit together into the layer that if you don't have it right now, this is where you want to be investing. This is where you want to be looking at some technologies that can potentially fill your immediate burning need. Again, they're just part of the overall puzzle here. And we could spend a whole nother hour talking about all these layers and how they fit together. But if you are in a situation where you are lacking any of those purple boxes, now would be the time to try to fill those gaps in order to enable the connectedness and collaboration of your teams today and tomorrow. Now, we go a little bit further with collaboration. A couple other examples of what we would describe as pilots. One is recognition programs. So I talked about gamification before, and that's what we're really talking about here. How do we incentivize people to do the right things? What I often say is that people don't share their knowledge for one of three reasons. One, because they're afraid of losing their power. They think if they're the only person that knows something, that their job is safe. And let's face it, today more than ever, people are worried about their job security. We are on the brink of a potential global economic drawback. If I could put that even stronger, but I won't. So that idea that knowledge is power and people want to hold on to their knowledge is a big challenge, and it will become a bigger challenge in the coming days. Two, people don't share knowledge because they're afraid of getting in trouble. They are worried that they're going to share something that their boss didn't want them to share and that they're going to get their wrist slapped or worse for it. Again, job security comes into play there. And then number three is that people don't share knowledge because it's too hard, because the tools aren't easy for them to share their knowledge with it, that it's not simple, it's not intuitive, it takes too many steps, there's too many requirements around it. And so before you even figure out the recognition program, part of this is about ensuring that you have the right understanding from leadership of what knowledge should be shared, what the mission or vision for this is. So let me say this really clearly. A lot of organizations make the mistake of saying, hey, everybody, share your knowledge. And then they just leave it at that. And people don't really know what to do with that. And so you can break down two of those three barriers of it's hard and people are afraid of getting in trouble by directing people of what knowledge to share, how to share it, and then rewarding them for doing so. Actually creating leaderboards or dashboards that show which groups or departments are sharing this knowledge most effectively. By creating rating systems so that people with the most highly rated shared content get rewarded for it. Over the longer term, actually building this into people's annual reviews. Now, if you do this wrong, there's a ton of unexpected consequences. And again, we could spend more time talking about that later. But for right now, the idea is that building recognition is one of the best ways to instill that long-term culture of knowledge sharing. Now, you can start that today. You won't necessarily create a complete KM recognition program over the next month of remote work. But this is a great area to experiment. Pay attention to what people are asking about online, the information that they're struggling to find, and create bounties, create little rewards or weekly check-ins for the question that the sharing the content that you want people to share. Create minor reinforcements that potentially prove out the value of a broader KM recognition program. And the other is an initiative tracker. The idea here being that if your organization all of a sudden is becoming aware of the value of KM because they're in a moment of crisis, there are opportunities to harness that to define a roadmap for longer term KM. And one of the ways to model good behavior is to report on your successes and your failures. Create a tracker online where people can log in and see what's been accomplished, what's changing within the organization as a result. This is a way of demonstrating your own knowledge sharing. It is also a way of showing measurable successes of how KM results in return on investment, business value. At the end of the day, it all comes back to that, and that's how you get KM to stick. That's how you get the cultural piece to stay. And then off to the side here, again, we talk about, again, some of the things that you can do today, low cost or no cost. Even if you don't have the infrastructure in place, you can easily get it from readily available open source or low cost tools. Some of the stuff that we're doing, Slack channels, dress your dog, your pet, your plant, or your cat up as using EK swag and show the picture online. Show recipes, and we're going to capture those recipes and put them into an EK cookbook that we give as a gift to new employees. As we've been onboarding people remotely for the first time, we've asked all of our existing employees to share something about themselves, their favorite moment of 2020 so far, or their greatest accomplishment, or a word of advice for the new employee. All of these are ways of harnessing existing technology, including email, to build that social, collaborative, human connection and get people comfortable with sharing knowledge online.
And I would just add there, Zach, you mentioned earlier how you were hesitant in the beginning of EK to do remote work. And by doing so, you actually created a lot of really strong connections between the team. And a lot of these things that we mentioned here that we're doing remotely are things that we did prior to being remote. And that really has carried over into our new normal. And so I think that for other organizations, this new normal really shines light on the strengths and weaknesses from a KM standpoint of your organization. And it's just been a really interesting experience to see how an organization can really maintain that connectedness and that collaboration and culture, even when you shift to everybody being in their own homes as opposed to being in the same office.
And if you're looking for another example of that, sign up for next week's webinar, which is actually a roundtable called KM Nothing to Whine About. It'll sort of after hours, and we're going to be drinking wine and talking about knowledge management. So there's the shameless plug. So last kind of parting thought here. Some of you might be saying, okay, Mary, I get it. Yes, the current remote work situation is shining a light on how we're bad at KM, but what do we do immediately? What can we do today to fix it? We want you to walk away with a couple potential actions. One is start tracking the pieces of content that people are striving for, that they're lacking, that they can't find, that they're ripping their hair out, that they're waiting for answers on. Start logging those materials, look for themes, and find ways to immediately start promoting that content via an intranet, via a blog, via whatever tool you can harness to basically start prioritizing the most valuable content within your organization. Number two, culture. We just talked about it. Turn it into a happy hour, turn it into games, turn it into a talk from somebody in the company. Use some of these online tools. We're planning a EK trivia contest so that we can, again, have a way of sharing our corporate knowledge, but also having some fun and relating to each other when we miss each other. So think of those things you miss. Think of the people that you miss. Think of the things that you miss doing in the office and ask yourself, how can you adapt? How can KM take the lead in bringing the office home to your team to drive that culture? And then lastly, get leadership involved. Have leadership share a session. Maybe it's about the remote work itself. Maybe it's best practices or how they've adapted or what they miss. Maybe it's on a different topic. But having leadership model engagement is a critical piece, especially if you are not prepared. Now, I know we took a lot of time here, but I think we've got time for a couple questions. Madison, have any questions come in?
Yes, I got one from one individual. What specific tools, I know you mentioned Slack, but any others would you recommend for better collaboration?
Yeah, so I think this comes down to what you mean by collaboration, right? So if you mean online meetings and just being able to learn more from each other, it's the Skypes and the Zooms and the Google Chats. If you're picturing more what am I supposed to be doing? What are my employees doing? How do I ask questions and get broad answers? It's going to be the Slacks and the Buddy Press community practice type of sites. And if you're talking more about document collaboration, it's going to be stuff like O365, Teams, Google Docs. The key is to recognize that there are very few tools that do all of those things. And even if they purport to do all of those things, they don't generally do them the best. And so the really important recommendation here is to make a decision on the behavior that is hard, that you want to encourage, the actions that used to happen naturally in the office that you're now struggling with, and pick the tool that is very pointedly to do that thing, to address that gap or that need, and then explain to everybody what the tool is for. Don't just throw the tool over the fence. Don't just say, hey, remote work time, emergency, everybody, here's a new tool. Contextualize it. Ideally, seed it with existing content. If it's a community of practice where you want people having conversations online, pull a few of your experts in advance of exposing it and have them begin populating it so there's context there. If it's a tool like Slack, start a couple channels with a smaller group so that there's modeled behavior of what you want in there. Begin a couple channels that have very clean and explicit topics that answer burning needs, so that the first time somebody logs in, they don't just see an empty space and are told to good luck, figure it out. They see something that they can immediately interact with and get value out of.
Yeah, and I would also add there, Zach, that you don't necessarily have to invest in new tools, that sometimes there's value in discovering the features and functionalities of the tools that you already have. So at EK, we do a lot of in-person workshops, and sometimes it's really hard to replicate that experience of being in a room with people collaborating. But in the past few weeks, I've learned that Zoom has a whiteboard that you can use, or a voting feature. You can take people and break them out into different rooms. And if you want to have a little fun with it, you can even change your background to something that really showcases your personality. So I would say take a look at the tools that you already have in your organization and discover new ways of using them.
Wonderful, thank you too. And I have one last question from an individual. They're saying, hey, my boss really depends on ROI. Do you have any ROI on KM for remote work?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think we're going to see the folks that run offices and sell office space having a pretty big heartburn over the next year. I anticipate that organizations that never thought that they could work effectively remotely are finding that, in fact, that they can, and that maybe some of them are not going to return to the office in the same way that they previously did. So why would that be the case? Well, one is that a lot of employees actually work super effectively from home. They see it as a major job perk. And so remote work done well actually leads to higher employee satisfaction, which results in higher employee retention. And so higher employee retention means less time and less cost spent recruiting, less time and less cost spent training and upskilling employees, because you've got the well-tenured ones there from whom the others can learn. The big challenge and concern that I mentioned was productivity. Well, are people going to be as productive at home, especially when they don't have a dedicated workspace, especially when they've got their dog or pet or child or cross between those things interrupting them? But it's interesting. You can look online. There are many long-term studies that find that employee productivity actually increases over the long term. Once people get over the hump of learning how to work effectively from home, they actually become more productive. So there's actually a return on investment from that productivity standpoint, the quality of the work perspective, which then translates to higher customer satisfaction, and we all know what that means. Okay, I think that's it. Madison, you want to close us out?
Yeah, no, thank you everyone for attending today's session. Just a reminder, it will be available within about 24 hours on our website. So feel free to check back and share it with anyone that you think would benefit from the knowledge Zach and Mary have shared today. So thank you all, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.